Saint Athanasius and
Mhm.
his On the Incarnation talks about when Christ is lifted up into the air, meaning crucified. That's the thing that shows up in all the hymnody about the demons are cast down, right?
Yeah.
Because they dwell in the air, right? The demons are, the dwellers of the air. And so as he's lifted up, just as when he goes into the waters, right? The waters are made holy. So when he's lifted up, the demons are cast down. And with this, there's the insistence that as he then gives up his spirit and goes into the realm of the dead, right? Which you don't have to believe that Hades is a subterranean region beneath your feet. Philo of Alexandria certainly didn't.
Maybe like another dimension or something is a good
Right.
way of
Well,
looking. The upside down, or I don't know.
Right. Or just think of it in the sense that you stepped outside of your body. Well, where are you? You're in the realm of the dead.
Last question, and I wanted to bring this up because of your episode on the harrowing of Hades.
Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody just watch this episode. We're not going to recap it, but real
Mhm.
quick, if you could just, my audience doesn't really need a recap. They know what the harrowing of Hades is, but we just had Pascha, and it's a huge theme in Eastern Christianity, of course.
Yeah.
Holy Saturday is
Mhm.
humongous. It does show up in the West, but it's just kind of slowly faded away, but I think beginning to make a comeback again.
Yeah.
Why is this significant in Orthodox theology? And then have you seen it show up in films? Is the film industry really aware of harrowing of Hades, or are they kind of tapping into like a bigger theme?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with why it's significant. I mean, it's significant within Eastern Christianity is largely because of the ways in which Eastern Christianity understands the Christian gospel, the human condition and the Christian gospel, put obviously in how that contrasts with the Latin West. So the Latin West has a highly, as you know, is a highly judicial disposition toward religion, right? God's a lawgiver. The human condition is that we're lawbreakers. Future judgment is the big problem. The incarnation is probably primarily about creating a mechanism by which to remedy our judicial, issues and so on like this. And that's one of the reasons why the crucifixion then becomes sort of the centerpiece of Latin Christianity. And then in some ways, what's interesting is what happens after that and becomes a head scratcher, right? So I used to do this sort of experiment in my classes with, where I knew I had only, Western Christians. And I would lay out a case for, the idea that, I would take like a penal substitution view of the atonement or something like that. And I'd lay out the premises that your condition is that you're, judicially, facing this judicial problem at the future judgment. And Christ's crucifixion is ultimately meant to remedy that condition. So if you believe that Christ paid for your sins on the cross, then that situation is remedied right then and there. So if Christ, was not raised from the dead, like, shouldn't you still be saved? And obviously, like, all the people who have ever read the New Testament are going like, I'm pretty sure the answer is no, but I don't know why. Right. Like, and that was kind of the nature of it. And I always did that specifically in order to disrupt their understanding and say, like, maybe there's more going on here. If your understanding of the narrative cannot account for the significance of the resurrection, other than that it's proof that God, accepted his sacrifice on the cross or something like that, then there's maybe something anemic about your understanding that is problematic. And so, contrasting that with the Eastern Christian, what you find in the Eastern Church Fathers, you really see that the human condition as they understand is primarily that we are dying, right? That what the fall has done is it's inverted our human nature. We as icons of God are made to partake of God, participate in God, and raise up the lower nature by the higher nature, right? Through participation, deification, partaking of the divine nature, and in this way, partaking of the divine attributes, which is the source of, eternal life, immortality, the things promised in the gospel. But of course, having turned away from God, our nature's been distorted. Basically we find ourselves sort of crippled and living the life of an animal that is mortal and dies, right? And that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And so so central to how the Eastern Church Fathers understand this is the idea that our salvation begins with the incarnation, where the Creator God himself, right, the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, takes on our nature, becomes one of us, and by taking on our nature is healing it, right, through communion with it, right? That by him taking it on, he begins to restore it back to what it is made to be. And this is one of the significance, right? Like by taking on our nature, he heals the will, right? This is one of the reasons why the church fathers are so insistent in all of the Christology that Christ has everything that we have, right? Like, does he have a human mind? Of course he does, because if he doesn't, he hasn't healed the human mind. Does he have a
Yeah,
human will?
what
Of
cannot,
course he
yeah,
does, right? Right.
what's not assumed cannot be healed. Yeah.
That's right. And so when Gregory of Nazianzen says that, he's capturing that aspect of it. And this plays out all throughout the ministry of the life of Christ, where we go into the waters to be purified, but he goes into the waters in order to purify them, right? Him going into them, he makes them holy, right? When people who are sick and unclean touch him, rather than him becoming unclean, he makes them whole, right? That's the theme that emerges over and over and over again. And what you see is you see this even in the crucifixion, the descent into Hades, and ultimately in the resurrection. So while there are all sorts of different things said about the crucifixion of Christ, right? The fish hook theory of Gregory of Nyssa and things like that. One of the things you also see here is this reiteration of purifying of the air. So Saint Athanasius and his On the Incarnation talks about when Christ is lifted up into the air, meaning crucified. That's the thing that shows up in all the hymnody about the demons are cast down, right?
Yeah.
Because they dwell in the air, right? The demons are the dwellers of the air. And so as he's lifted up, just as when he goes into the waters, right? The waters are made holy. So when he's lifted up, the demons are cast down. And with this, there's the insistence that as he then gives up his spirit and goes into the realm of the dead, right? Which, you don't have to believe that Hades is a subterranean region beneath your feet. Philo of Alexandria certainly didn't.
Yeah, maybe like another dimension or something is a good way
Right.
to
Well,
think. The upside down, or I don't know.
right. Or just think of it in the sense that you stepped outside of your body. Well, where are you? You're in the realm of the dead, right?
That's what I normally say is like you're immediately in Hades the moment you die.
That's right.
And so everyone has to be liberated from Hades.
That's right. That's right. And so just like everything else, Christ in entering Hades, he who is life himself, as he steps into that, just like he purifies the waters, he purifies the air, he purifies the unclean, as he steps in there, right? He who has life in himself, who is incorrupt, ends up overturning or purifying the place of corruption. And that's the liberation of the dead from the realm of Hades. And so that's one of the reasons what's celebrated on Holy Saturday is obviously there's the one homily that's oftentimes read on Holy Saturday about Christ going and finding Adam and starting by talking about all the sort of inverted imageries of him reaching out and taking from a tree and me being hung on a tree, right? They go through all those sorts of images, Eve taken from his side, the spear piercing his side, and all that, as he goes to rescue Adam, and then with Adam all of his progeny. And so the idea here is, of course, that, is that Hades has held men captive. And the Eastern Fathers talk about part of how they understand when Christ talks about you can't, sort of rob a strong man unless you first bind him, right? There is this insistence that, well, the strong man is Satan, who has held men captive by death. And Christ has now bound the strong man and is ransacking his house by going into it and bringing life, he who is life, right? Bringing that life to the realm of the dead. And that's, of course, comes through in John Chrysostom's Paschal homily, where he talks about Hades itself being vexed because, it took in a body and encountered God, right? It took in the visible and encountered the invisible, all these sorts of things, until it basically vomits up the dead, so to speak. And I reference it in that letter, but I love in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is obviously not scripture, but is nonetheless an early Christian text.
Oh yeah, it's all related to all those ancient liturgical texts. Like it ends up in the liturgy.
That's right.
Or in the liturgy first. They're all kind of swirling together. So.
Yeah, but the conversation between Hades and the devil, right, where the devil's trying to prep and here Hades is envisioned, as a sentient being who swallows men and holds them within him, and he's asking him, telling him to prepare himself to receive this Jesus. And he's like, is this the same Jesus who has robbed me of other men?
Lazarus.
And and he's like, it is the same Jesus. And he's like, I implore you by your might and my mind, do not bring this man to me. It's such a great scene. And so anyway, and so that's where the resurrection of Christ is not just some like God saying, "Yep, he was who I was saying, and now I've accepted his payment on the cross." The resurrection of Christ is this undoing of death, where you finally see the restoration of man completed, where not only has our will been healed, our mind been healed, our flesh has been transformed, transfigured such that, it is incorrupt, and he's, exited the realm of the dead, and with it, right, he's
Yeah.
falling on his train. And that's one of the reasons why in all of the icons, all the ancient icons, Orthodox icons, this is why Hades is always part of that icon. And so whether it's, the gaping hole, which is, yeah, it's the tomb, but there's a reason why it's empty with a bunch of broken chains and bones down there. And why sometimes there's a strong man bound up who looks awful lot like the devil down there, and then all of the, the saints are out there with him. It's because that is the theme, right? It's not just that
Right.
he's raising himself, but he's raising humanity with him as he, as he bursts Hades and brings life to the dead. So that would be the significance in, Eastern Orthodoxy is the way in which it understands the work of Christ and the redemptive work for us. And in this sense, right, the way's been opened up for God, right? Opened back up, for us to, return to God. And so you find, I think it's Saint Macarius who talks about, the real Hades is the heart of man, and that Christ, descends into that and, sort of liberates us from the death that is there. But in terms of like appearances in film, I mean, obviously you have some sort of tip of the hat to that in Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. I don't know how many people know that that's what's going on when he's got like the devil writhing.
Right.
No,
I heard it's gonna show up in the second movie, like the second Passion. I don't
yeah,
know. You might know more
yeah.
than I do. I mean, yeah. Close your mouth. You can't talk about it.
No, no, no.
Uh,
I can.
okay.
No, no, no. So Mel has wanted to do this movie for years, and I've talked to a lot of different people in his circle who know that he's wanted to do it for years. Now, I think the thing is, like, this is where I love Mel's work. I'm a little nervous about it, like partially because I think there are significant differences between East and West on the harrowing of Hades. The very fact that in the West it's always referred to as the harrowing of hell, and hell and Hades are different in the biblical text and in the liturgical text, even though translators oftentimes use them interchangeably, unfortunately. Um, and there's significant differences between how that doctrine was received and interpreted over the years in the Latin West, where there's a resistance to, in some ways it almost becomes like Christ just sort of goes down there to say like, see you suckers, right? Like in certain contexts in the Latin West, it really does not have the same type of significance. It gets more and more diluted. And then also with that, because there's this highly locational sort of concept of heaven and hell and things like that, that is very different than what you and I said, which is the moment you step out of your body, you're in Hades. I think there's this tendency, that's part of the reason why a lot of Protestants are like, well, is there any biblical evidence for Christ, sort of going into hate? And it's like, well, do you think he died? Like,
Yeah. Where was his soul? Like,
where was
yeah.
right? And the
He
answer
went
is
to
yes, there is
America. Yeah.
biblical evidence, there is, but
Yeah.
like, even if there weren't, like, where did he
Right.
go? Right? Like,
Right.
obviously he went into Hades. And so like, what I'm expecting, I don't know what to expect with Mel's project, because I I expect that I expect it's going to be super fantastical. Christ going in there with swords
Mhm.
and doing battle with, Leviathan or something like that. Like, I think it's going to be some crazy fantastical spectacle. It might be a good time, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, but I don't have high hopes for the theology of it.
Well, he's
Um,
also more trad Catholic too, so he might even push more into that sort of like
mhm.
like more that you would find with that. I mean, when you look at kind of more of the newer Catholic scholars over the last 50 years, they might try to go more in the kind of the Eastern direction a little bit more than they were.
Yeah.
But with him being from that more background, it's just hard to say. I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah,
It's
we'll
true.
find out.
Yeah, I mean, it is true, and I don't know what to expect. There are certain projects that sometimes I get wind of or come across my desk, like in my episode on the Mary movie, I got that script long before
Mm,
Netflix made it,
mm, mhm.
and I have an episode on my podcast where I talk about it and I critique it, and I talk about storytelling. Um, this one, all I know is it's been a project that he's wanted to do for
Yeah.
years and years. So I've known about this project for years, and now that he's talking about it, right, it sounds like he's actually going to finally do it.
Mhm.
But I really have no idea what to expect, and specifically for the reasons well I named and you named right there. Um, so
Let me ask you
yeah,
about Stranger Things. 11, so 11, like, is it season 4? I don't know. She's, like, goes into the Upside Down in many ways to, like, defeat, you know,
right.
and but there's a scene where she's almost tied up, like, on a cross.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
just
right,
kinda
where
there's
she's
just
sort of, like, psychically thrown up against the wall and all that,
yeah, but
and
she's
the
like
vines,
this.
right,
Yeah, well, my
mhm.
screen's not big enough for you to see it,
Yeah,
but,
yeah, no, no, I got it.
it almost kinda looks like this crucifixion scene in hell.
Yeah.
It's an interesting sort of and I wasn't sure how much they were aware of this kind of
Well, these
sometimes
are
people
yeah,
they just tap into it, and they don't even know that they are tapping into it.
right, and that is the thing, like, and even in season 1, you had, Hopper go in after Will, so he sort of goes in. Now, of course, that was less explicit, but there definitely was and I think that's season 1, right? Where he infiltrates and he goes and he finds Will and he brings him out.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously, I think you could see those sorts of parallels. I think you're right that it would be I would not be shocked, right, to find that that imagery was there. But it's also sort of odd that sometimes, like, these sort of things sometimes become Rorschach tests where it's like it's like, are we seeing a thing that was intentionally there, or is that
Right.
like, or is this purely accidental? And it's sort of like, you know, it's just Hollywood being Hollywood, and it's like, oh,
Exactly.
you guys spoke better than you knew, right? Is this one of those sorts of things? And I really don't know. I
Yeah.
haven't heard anything about their perspective on the upside down and that sort of thing. Although the Heiser connection, I was fascinated to find that. I
Yeah.
didn't know that he'd done that book on it.
Mhm.
But
Yeah. I mean, if I'm talking about, like, the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, then I can speak much more confidently, like when
yeah,
Gandalf's fighting the Balrog and they fall into sort of like this place that looks like Sheol, like a
yeah,
watery kind of chaos, and
mhm,
he
yeah,
defeats this beast. It's like, that is totally Herring
right,
of Hell,
right.
imagery. So,
Right, or talking about the sort of ransom theory of the
yeah,
atonement and things like that with people like Lewis, right? Or
yeah,
yeah, I mean, totally those that they know the source material. So that's not an accident. Something like Stranger Things, I can't say. But I have said, like, I do have a concept of how I would if I ever had the capacity to do a full-blown, show kind of like The Chosen, which was on the life of Christ. I know how I would do it, and it would be pretty fantastical, and it would definitely include, the harrowing of Hades. And I'd love to be able to do that, but we'll
mhm.
see. We'll see.
I think the Holy Saturday theme is a really rich a very rich theme that can be developed in all sorts of directions in films,
Yeah.
without people really fully seeing it and knowing it, but yeah.
Yeah, actually, yeah, and there was, in a I don't know how explicitly I can talk about it, but I'll just say that there was a project that I worked on that did have an entire episode that was modeled after that. That was sort of like doing archetypes of that,
Yeah.
which was pretty cool, but unfortunately, it didn't make the final cut because that's how the machinery works.
It